Hey, hope you're enjoying your long weekend. And I know the last thing you wanted today probably was a pesky announcement video from me, but I noticed some patterns in reading your last thought primer number 2, in which you were evaluating various arguments for validity and soundness. And in particular, I noticed a pattern of folks not knowing exactly what strategy to use to determine whether or not a given argument is valid or invalid. And this is such an important concept. I wanted to make you a really short video going over this very basic strategy for doing this, because literally this question of validity and arguments, it is going to come up for us every single week of the semester. Okay, so it's the most important concept for the course, and it's the concept you really want to make sure that you're working to get your mind wrapped around, so that you understand exactly what it is and you understand the strategies you should be using for determining whether or not an argument is valid or invalid. So I'd really encourage you to take notes as you watch this really short video, and I'll try to keep it really short so you can get on with your holiday here. All right, so question on the table is about validity and invalidity. An argument is valid only when it's totally impossible for the conclusion to be false when the premises are true. Okay, so if there's no way the conclusion of an argument could be false when the premises are true, that's a valid argument. Okay, but if you can think of just one way the conclusion of an argument could be false even though the premises are both true, then you've got an invalid argument. It's an unreliable one. It's one you don't want to take any more of your time with. Okay, so the thing that I see people getting tripped up by is they look at an argument, they know the actual truth values of the premises or the conclusion, and they use their knowledge of the actual truth values to determine whether or not the argument is valid. Don't do that. Okay, that is never going to, well, I shouldn't say that. That will only coincidentally lead you to the right answer. You want to, when you're evaluating arguments for validity, you want to sort of push aside your knowledge of the actual truth values of the statements that make up the argument, the premises, and the conclusion. And instead, what you want to do is this. You want to work from the assumption that the premises are both true. And that doesn't matter whether or not they are actually true. You're just going to assume those premises are true. Because what you're doing when you evaluate an argument for validity is you're not evaluating the content of the argument, you're evaluating the form of the argument. And so you kind of want to push aside for the moment the actual statements that are being made and whether or not they're true or false, and you just want to assume that they're true. And then you want to ask yourself, if these statements turn out to be true, these premise statements, is there any way that conclusion could be false? And if there's not, if it has to be true, then you've got yourself a valid argument. But if you can think of one way that conclusion could be false, even when those premises are true, boom, invalid argument, no longer worthy of our consideration. So let's take a look at an argument. Premise number 1, if you're watching John talk about logic, then you're using some kind of electronic device. Premise number 2, you're using some kind of electronic device. And the conclusion, therefore, you're watching John talk about logic. Now, what you might do, the mistake you might make, is you might say, well, yeah, it's true, the first premise. If I am watching John talk about logic, then I am using some kind of electronic device, because he's not teaching face-to-face right now. The only access that I have to him when he's talking about logic is through my phone or my tablet or my computer. So yeah, the first premise seems to be true. And the second premise seems to be true as well. I mean, after all, you're sitting there right now, right, with a phone or a tablet or a computer in front of you. And it also seems that the conclusion is true. You're watching me talk about logic. Okay, so you could make the mistake of concluding that because the premises are true and the conclusion is true, that this is a valid argument. And we'd say, no, you can't do that. Instead, what you have to do is just work from the assumption that the premises are true, disregard the fact that they are actually true. If those two premises are true, is there any way that conclusion could be false? And the answer is yes. Okay? So yes, let's just assume it's true that if you're watching John talk about logic, you're using some kind of electronic device, and let's assume that the second premise is also true. You're using some kind of electronic device. How could it be false therefore, that you're watching John talk about logic? How could that conclusion not follow from those premises if the premises are true? And we say, well, maybe it is true that if I were watching John talk about logic, I'd be using some kind of electronic device. And maybe it's true I'm using some sort of electronic device. But I'm watching YouTube videos about cats right now. Therefore, the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. Okay? So I thought of one way It's possible for the conclusion to be false even when the premises are true, which tells me that even though I have true premises and a true conclusion, I have an invalid argument. In fact, this argument has a name called affirming the consequent, and it is always invalid. This form of argument, regardless of the content, is never a reliable argument. So we're not even going to waste our time figuring out whether or not the premises are true, because it won't lead us to any kind of conclusion by logical necessity. We'll look at affirming the consequent later on this semester. All right, let's look at another argument. All dogs are human. You're a dog. Therefore, you're a human. Okay? Now, I know the premises are false. Who cares? I'm going to push aside my knowledge of the actual truth values of the premises, and instead I'm going to ask myself this. What if the premises were true? If I assume the premises are both true, would this conclusion by logical necessity follow from them? In other words, is there any way it could be false that you're a human if the two premises were true? And the answer is, there's no way for that conclusion to be false when the premises are true. If it's true that all dogs are human and you're a dog, then by definition you're also a human, because all dogs are human and you're a dog, the second premise says. Okay? So now if you think about what we have here, we have an argument with false premises, a true conclusion, and it's valid. Okay? Now it's not sound. It's valid, but it's unsound. It's not sound because the two premises are both false. All it takes is for one premise to be false to make the argument unsound. Okay? So we have a valid argument that is unsound because it has false premises. But the important point for us is we determined that the argument was a valid one, even though at first glance it looks like a bad argument because the two premises are such obviously false statements. Okay? But when we're determining validity, we're not concerned with what the actual truth values of the premises are. We're concerned with what would happen if the premises were true. All right, let us look at just, I think, one more. Oh, no, we'll have two more. All right, here's another argument for you. Every time it rains, the sun is shining. It's raining right now. Therefore, the sun is shining. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, all right, I'm not going to look out my window to determine what the weather is because I don't care what the actual truth values of the premises are. What I care about is this. If those premise statements turned out to be true, would the conclusion also have to be true by logical necessity? Is there any way the conclusion could be false when those premises are true? So we're just going to assume it's true that every time it rains, the sun is shining, and we're going to assume that it's raining right now. Would that mean the sun has to be shining? Is there any way it could be false that the sun is shining if the two premises are true? And the answer is, well, no. I mean, if it's true, if it's true that every time it rains, the sun is shining, and if it's true that it's raining right now, then it would have to be true that the sun is shining, because the first premise says every time it rains, the sun is shining. And the second premise says it's raining. Therefore, the sun has to be shining. So what we have here is an argument that has false premises, right? You know that it's not the case that every time it rains, the sun is shining. It's cool when the sun is shining and it rains, right? But that's sort of out of the ordinary. Usually when it's raining, the sun is not shining. So our first premise is false. We get that. And as I look out my window right now, it's gross and it's foggy here in Arcata at whatever time it is, 10:40 on Monday, but it's not raining. Okay? So both those premises are false, and the conclusion is false. The sun is not shining. I wish it were, but it's not. Okay? So you have an argument that has false premises, a false conclusion, and yet it's valid. Okay, so now once we come across an argument that we determine is valid, then what we say is, oh, well, this is an argument that's been put together in a reliable way. Now it's worth my time to go in and figure out whether or not the premises are actually true or not. Because if they are true, the conclusion will have to be true. But if one or more of the premises are false, I'm done with that argument. Because that means it's an unsound argument and it's not going to really lead me to anywhere. All right, let's look at one more. And this last one is similar to a problem that really tripped people up in your homework related to some wars. I can't remember what the wars were. But here's our argument. The Civil War occurred after World War II. Second premise, World War II occurred before the Korean War. Therefore, the Korean War occurred after the U.S. Civil War. Now, sometimes you're going to come across arguments, and they're going to be like, ugh, what? It just seems like so many words, and I don't know how to arrange them so that I can even make sense of them. And we'll work on some strategies for doing that, actually this week. But for now, here's another thing you might want to think about, is sometimes you can evaluate an argument for validity by creating visual representations of the ideas that make up the argument. Let me show you what I mean by that. So let's take that first premise. The U.S. Civil War occurred after World War II. And if we were going to put that on a in chronological order on a timeline, okay, we'd situate the Civil War after World War II on that chronology to show that the U.S. Civil War occurred after World War II. Now again, I'm not concerned with the actual truth value of this premise. I want to know what it looks like if this premise were true. I'm just going to work from the assumption it's true, and if it were true and I wanted to create a visual representation of it, it would look something like this. Okay. Now I might do something similar for the second premise. World War II occurred before the Korean War. All right. So on my chronology here, I'm just going to situate World War II before the Korean War to show that World War II occurred before the Korean War. Now this argument is saying that if these two premises are true, then by logical necessity, this conclusion would also be true. The Korean War occurred after the U.S. Civil War. So now what I have to do is figure out how to arrange these three wars in a chronology that doesn't contradict the premises, and to see if that chronology is reflected by that conclusion. And if it is, maybe the argument is valid. So maybe I could do something like this. I could put World War II here at the very beginning. That shows that World War II occurred before the Korean War. And I could put the Civil War here, and that shows that the Civil War occurred after World War II. And it does seem to show, therefore, that the Korean War occurred after the Civil War. Okay? So the conclusion seems to follow if I arrange these three wars in this order. But what if I did this? What if I arranged them in this order? Does this timeline still show that the U.S. Civil War occurred after World War II? Yuppers. Does it show that World War II occurred before the Korean War? Yup. Does it also show the conclusion that the Korean War occurred after the U.S. Civil War? Nope. Okay, so here's the significance. What that means is, even if these two premises are true, this conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. It might, just like we have right here, but it doesn't have to, because we just created a possibility that doesn't contradict any of the premises. The premises are still shown to be true in this final line here. But the conclusion is not reflected on the final line. And that means maybe this conclusion follows from these two premises, maybe it doesn't. Okay, I can think of one possible way that it doesn't. And it only takes that one possible way for the argument to be invalid. And once we determine the argument is invalid, we're done. There's no point in considering any further an invalid argument because it's not put together right. It's not reliable. But if it's valid, then we give it more of our time. Then we say, I'm going to go in and look at those premises. All right, so remember, an argument is valid if it's totally impossible for the conclusion to be false when the premises are true. If you can think of one possible way the conclusion could be false, even when the premises are true, then you've got yourself an invalid argument, just like the last one we looked at, that we found a way to consider the premises true, and yet the conclusion wasn't necessarily true, and that made it invalid. Important, do not concern yourself initially with the actual truth value of the premises of the conclusion. Who cares? For validity, all we're concerned about is, what if? What if those premises are true? Then would the conclusion follow by logical necessity? All right? So when determining validity, do not consider whether the premises are actually true or false. Just assume they're true. If an argument is invalid, stop. Now I'm repeating myself. It's automatically unsound. Okay. What I mean by that is this. I saw lots of folks saying like, oh, in fact, I saw some folks saying this argument's invalid but sound. It's like, no. Only valid arguments can be sound. By definition, all invalid arguments are also unsound. Okay. So once you have arrived at the conclusion that an argument is invalid and you think you have a way to prove that, stop. It's not worth any more of your time. Don't waste any more of your time on it. On the other hand, if you come across an argument and you determine, you know what, it's valid, that's something valuable because somebody is saying to you, I have knowledge of the way that things are and I can reflect that knowledge in some premises. And I think those premises in the way that they're put together by logical necessity would lead to yet another claim about the way that things are. And then we get to extend our knowledge about the way that reality is, and we have reasons that we can point to in support of the conclusions we've drawn about reality. All right, if this video makes sense, rock on. If it doesn't, shoot me an email and we'll chat.